Hi, everybody. Welcome to the True Crime Nurse. My name is Kat, and I am your registered nurse who loves all things nursing and true crime. Today's case is absolute insanity. If I didn't do the research myself, I honestly would have thought that this was a movie script because it's just so unbelievable. In the summer of 2022, a rural community in Texas became the scene of an unfathomable tragedy. An escaped inmate and convicted killer with cartel ties led authorities on a 3-week manhunt that ended in the brutal massacre of 5 family members in their ranch in Texas. The victims, Mark Collins and his 4 young grandsons, were beloved members of their community. Today I'm going to share with you the story of an inmate's prison bus escape, the chaotic 21-day manhunt to find him, and the horrific killings of an entire family. Before we dive in, using our nursing SBAR format, please be sure to like, subscribe, and comment down below any case suggestions that you have. Thank you so much, Mad Dog, for today's recommendation. On Thursday, June 2nd, 2022, Mark Collins and his 4 grandsons arrived at the family's ranch near Centerville that morning, eager to start their mini vacation. The Collins Ranch was a familiar and happy place with a cabin, a pond for fishing, and plenty of space to ride ATVs or shoot targets. The boys had been looking forward to this dream trip since school got out for the summer. The 5 of them were inseparable. This was their boys' trip, one final celebration before Waylon left for college, but they didn't know that it would be their last. It was supposed to be a time to bond, laugh, and fish under the hot Texas sun. But what nobody could have imagined was that a desperate fugitive was watching them, waiting for the right moment to strike. Hours passed after their arrival with no word from Mark or the boys, and the Collins family back in Tomball grew worried. Mark was known to check in regularly, so this was very out of character for him. According to reports, a concerned family member called Leon County authorities for a welfare check sometime before 6 p.m. This call was essentially sounding the alarm. Something might be wrong at the Collins Ranch. Shortly after 6 in the evening, Leon County police arrived at the Collins Ranch to perform the welfare check. There, they made a horrific discovery. Inside of the cabin, officers found the bodies of Mark Collins and all 4 of his grandsons. All 5 were pronounced dead at the scene. It is hard to overstate the shock and sorrow that responders felt at the pure horror that they witnessed that day. The confrontation that unfolded was clearly violent. All 5 family members were overpowered and killed sometime on June 2nd. The exact dynamics of who was attacked first, whether any of them tried to fight back or flee, are not known, and you'll find out why soon. But the injuries documented later by medical examiners tells a story of extreme brutality. Mark Collins suffered a fatal gunshot wound to the abdomen that was later identified as a shotgun wound, and he also had sharp penetrative injuries. These injuries mean that Mark may have been shot at close range, possibly with his own shotgun, and also stabbed. Being the adult and protector, Mark likely would have confronted Lopez first and took on the brunt of the attack, trying to defend his grandsons because he was found closest to the door. 18-year-old Waylon Collins was the oldest grandson, and he had a sharp force injury and gunshot wound to his back as well. A gunshot to the back may indicate that Waylon was shot while turning away or trying to shield someone else. It also may have been that he was either shot from behind unexpectedly or running. He also was stabbed, which was clearly a vicious overkill attack. 16-year-old Carson's cause of death was listed as a gunshot wound and stab wound. Similarly, 11-year-old Hudson Collins sustained gunshot and stab wounds as well. This indicates that both brothers were likely attacked with a combination of gunfire and knife strikes. The presence of both types of injuries on the younger boys is just heartbreaking because it means that they may have been trying to escape or resist during this chaotic attack, and they were brutally killed. Little 11-year-old Bryson, the 3 brothers' cousin, had lethal injuries that were attributed to a stab wound in the back. Unlike the others, Bryson's report did not note a firearm injury. It appears that the aggressor killed him with a blade alone. Based on the investigation, though, it seems that Bryson tried to run or was caught off guard, and the killer stabbed him from behind. You guys, this story is just sick. All 5 victims died on June 2nd, 2022, and their manner of death was clearly ruled a homicide by the medical examiner. The attack used both guns and knives to massacre the Collins family. The fact that multiple firearms were involved strongly suggests that he armed himself with the Collins' own guns during the attack. Investigators later confirmed that the aggressor stole an AR-15 style rifle and a pistol from the ranch, as well as the Collins pickup truck. We will never know the full story or the horrifying details of those final moments. Mark, the adult in charge and loving grandfather, along with Waylon, the oldest of the grandkids, would have done anything to protect the younger children. The violence of the scene later stunned even the most seasoned law enforcement officers. Leon County's Justice of the Peace, who also functioned as the coroner at the scene, described it as pure hell. This family suffered terribly in their final moments, and this is a fact that has deeply scarred their surviving loved ones and community. What I have yet to share, though, is that a manhunt was happening for an escaped inmate during this time. Before we continue on with what occurred after the discovery of the family that day, we need to talk about the perpetrator's escape. On May 12, 2022, 3 weeks before the family was violently murdered, convicted murderer Gonzalo Lopez escaped custody in Leon County, Texas. On that morning, Gonzalo Lopez was scheduled to be transported from the KHOU unit in Gatesville, Texas, to the Estelle unit in Huntsville for a medical appointment, and this is very normal for inmates. This journey would take him south through Leon County, passing near the town of Centerville along Highway 7. Lopez was one of 16 inmates aboard a white Texas Department of Criminal Justice transport bus, and due to his reputation, he was secured in a separate metal-caged compartment at the back of the bus, which is designed for high-risk prisoners like him. Transporting inmates is a very intense process, and it's supposed to be that way to prevent incidents like this from occurring. Preparations for transport began just after midnight for the morning. At around 12:48 a.m., officers brought Lopez 2 red bags to pack his personal belongings for that transfer. From the start of this process, TDCJ policies were violated. The officers failed to strip search Lopez when removing him from his cell, and they even allowed him to walk unrestrained to another inmate's cell to drop off a property bag. Inmate-to-inmate property transfers are strictly against the rules. Unknown to the officers, though, Lopez allegedly used this opportunity to hide contraband, likely the handcuff key and weapons that will come into play later. In fact, the bag was never searched by staff. That morning in the KHOU unit, multiple attempts at strip searching Lopez were made, but each was inadequate and not to the procedural standard. At around 9:30 in the morning, 2 officers initiated a search but were seen on surveillance video looking away and not thoroughly checking Lopez's clothing, missing contraband that he may or may not have had, which we know the answer to that now. A second strip search in the transport prep room happened around 10:20 in the morning, and it was also done improperly. Lopez wasn't made to remove his clothes, and his clothing was not fully searched. These lapses in judgment were critical errors that started this horrifying chain of events. Reports later found that if even one of these searches had been done properly, officers likely would have discovered Lopez's hidden handcuff key and his makeshift metal weapons, which may have prevented the escape. After the flawed searches, officers placed handcuffs with a cuff protector on Lopez that blocks access to the keyhole and also put leg restraints on him. However, the leg irons were applied over his pant legs, making them looser than they should have been. Crucially, they also failed to use what's called a boss chair on Lopez prior to loading him on the bus, which a boss chair is a body orifice security scanner. TDCJ policy requires this metal detecting scan for high-risk inmates like him, and it only takes a few seconds to use. Had they done it, the chair likely would have detected the key and weapons on Lopez's body, but just like all the other security measures in place, it was skipped in yet another breach of protocol. By late morning, Gonzalo Lopez was shackled improperly and loaded onto bus 841 for transport. At 11:11 in the morning, the bus departed the HOU's unit in Gatesville en route to Huntsville. Officer Randy Smith was driving, and Officer Jimmy Breiniger sat in the back as the designated guard for the inmates. Lopez was secured in the rear, restrictive housing cage of the bus that we talked about earlier that separated from inmates by metal grafting. Shortly after boarding, though, Lopez made his intentions known. He told other inmates he was going to escape and asked if they wanted to join him. Some inmates later reported that they thought he might be bluffing, but Lopez was serious. One inmate recalled Lopez asking if they were ready to, quote, rock and roll. Initially, at least one inmate agreed to help until Lopez revealed his full plan. He intended to kill the 2 officers on the bus, then hijack a car on the highway, likely by murdering the driver, and then flee to San Antonio, Texas. Upon hearing this, the others backed out, saying they didn't want the needle, and what they meant by that is they feared getting the death penalty as a result of being a part of Gonzalo's plan. Gonzalo Lopez did not fear this, though. As the bus continued down rural roads, Lopez began working to free himself. Over the next 90 minutes or so, around 1 p.m., he methodically executed his plan. Using a small key that he had hidden in his mouth, Lopez unlocked his handcuffs. He somehow slipped the cuff protector that was supposed to cover the keyhole off, which, again, makes me wonder if that was even correctly applied in the first place. Then, with improvised metal weapons about 8 to 10 inches long, he sawed through the metal grafting at the bottom of the cage door. Slowly and quietly, he cut an opening large enough for him to actually crawl through. The other inmates on board, whether out of fear or in support, we don't know, created a distraction during this time. They made noise, shouted, and even deliberately tried to block Officer Breiniger's view toward the back by standing up and kind of moving around the bus. Surprisingly, this plan worked. Officer Breiniger did not notice Lopez's escape activity, and the driver, Officer Smith, was focused on the road ahead. After approximately an hour and a half of cutting and wriggling his way out of his bind, at 1:15 p.m., Lopez squeezed his body out of the caged area. He suddenly emerged at the front of the inmate compartment near the driver. Officer Smith later said he felt a tug on his handgun down at his side, and he looked down to see Lopez climbing out of the hole at his feet. Lopez had crawled underneath the driver's area. Smith shouted and tried to slam on the brakes of the bus while using one hand to keep the pistol secured in his holster. The bus swerved and came to a sudden stop on Highway 7 near Centerville. The abrupt stop flung Lopez and the driver forward. Both men tumbled out of the driver's seat area and down the steps, falling out of the bus onto the side of the road. Now, outside of the bus, a life or death struggle ensued between Officer Smith and Lopez. Gonzalo Lopez was armed with one of his sharp metal implements and began violently attacking the officer. Smith fought back but sustained wounds during the process. He was stabbed in the hand and in the chest during this altercation. Lopez managed to take away Officer Smith's service handgun during this fight, but at the critical moment, Officer Breiniger, the rear guard, realized something was gravely wrong. He later said that he actually thought that the bus had crashed. Breiniger grabbed a 12-gauge shotgun from the bus and exited out the back door to see Lopez and Smith on the ground fighting. Breiniger shouted for Lopez to stop. Lopez broke free from Officer Smith and now, armed with the driver's pistol, jumped back onto the bus. He intended to drive away. Officer Breiniger confronted him at gunpoint inside of the bus, ordering again for him to stop or be shot. Lopez ignored the warning and managed to get the bus moving forward again. Breiniger fired his handgun twice at Lopez, and as Lopez continued to drive, Breiniger fired 2 more times. Lopez was completely undeterred. He accelerated the bus back onto the highway with 15 other inmates still inside of it, essentially making them hostages. As the bus began to pull away, Officer Smith, injured but still determined, grabbed the shotgun and fired at the rear tire, blowing it out. The bus, now riding on a shredded tire, only made it a few more miles down the road before Lopez completely lost control. The vehicle veered off of the highway near Road County 320 and crashed into a pasture. Lopez abandoned the wrecked bus and fled on foot into a wooded area just off of Highway 7. When Officer Breiniger and Officer Smith, who had been left behind, caught up to the scene, thanks to a passing motorist who gave them a ride, responding law enforcement were already there and informed them that Lopez had run into the forest. The other inmates remained on the bus and did not escape, and none of them were seriously harmed during this incident. It appears that Lopez deliberately orchestrated the chaos, all of this just for his own escape. Within minutes, dozens of law enforcement units, including local deputies, state troopers, and others, all swarmed the area. A command center was established in Centerville to coordinate the manhunt for Gonzalo Lopez. The time from Lopez's escape from the cage to his disappearance in the woods was just mere minutes, but it set off one of the biggest manhunts Texas has ever seen to date. The immediate law enforcement response was massive. Police from nearby small towns, including Leon County Sheriff's deputies, Texas Department of Public Safety or DPS troopers, TDCJ tracking dogs, and even U.S. Marshals quickly worked together to search for Lopez. Within 24 hours, Lopez was placed on Texas's 10 most wanted fugitives list, and authorities publicly warned that this escaped inmate was armed and dangerous. By the next day, May 13th, a reward of up to $50,000 was offered for information leading to Lopez's capture. 300 officers were soon involved in the manhunt, searching the rural landscape of Leon County for any sign of the violent fugitive. For the local residents of Centerville and surrounding areas, the situation was terrifying. A convicted killer who had shot at police and worked for cartels was hiding somewhere in the vicinity. Schools went into lockdown. Checkpoints were set up on the roads, and people were warned to stay inside. Leon County Sheriff's deputies and TDCJ search teams initially focused on just a 5-square-mile perimeter near the site of the bus crash. They brought in tracking dogs, they mounted patrol and aerial support with drones and helicopters to comb the forests and the desolate ranch lands. However, from the very beginning, the search faced challenges. The Texas sun was brutal in May, with daytime highs and high humidity wearing out the canine teams quickly. After only a short time, the dogs became prone to dehydration and heat exhaustion, forcing searchers to rotate them more frequently and potentially allowing Lopez more time to move or hide. There was also confusion in command. Reports later indicated that multiple agencies weren't sure who exactly was in charge during those early days, which led to, coordination issues in the field. And in fact, a TDCJ review later described the manhunt's initial phase as chaotic, noting instances where search areas may have been contaminated by too many people, and canine teams may have been deployed to the wrong areas due to that miscommunication. For nearly a week, hundreds of officers maintained a perimeter and scoured the Centerville area, but Gonzalo Lopez remained at large. Each day that passed heightened the community anxiety. By May 20th, 8 days after the escape, officials made a significant adjustment. They actually scaled back the concentrated search in Leon County. The Highway Route 7 that had been closed was then reopened to public traffic. This indicated that authorities were no longer confident that Lopez was pinned down in that immediate area anymore. He could have slipped through that original perimeter. The search for Lopez expanded statewide, with law enforcement broadcasting his description everywhere. Still, residents around Centerville were urged to remain cautious. Many locals later said that they kept firearms at hand and their doors locked at all times during those weeks, living in a constant state of hypervigilance. Throughout May 2022, sporadic tips and possible sightings came in, but nothing panned out. Lopez, it seemed, had completely vanished into the woods. In reality, he likely hunkered down in remote areas, living off of the land or finding shelter in unoccupied structures. But a break in the case finally came from a burglary report. On May 31st, a ranch property not far from the Collins family ranch was found to have been burglarized. Investigators responding to that burglary collected fingerprints and DNA, suspecting that it might be Lopez scavenging for food or clothing. This crucial evidence was sent for testing, but it was not immediately publicized. In fact, law enforcement did not announce this finding to the public at that time, likely to avoid tipping off Lopez that they knew his approximate location, or also to avoid alarming residents any further. Family friend David Crane later said that Lopez had apparently broken into that, quote, neighborhood property on Monday, end quote, May 30th, right next door to the Collins ranch. It's not clear if Mark Collins was aware of that burglary in the area when he decided to head to the ranch with his grandsons. We know what horrifying events took place just a couple of days later. After the murders, Lopez's actions were calculated. He stole the Collins family's white pickup truck, the 1999 Chevy Silverado, and loaded it with stolen firearms and other supplies. This truck was the key to his endgame, though: mobility and a means to get far away from Leon County. By mid to late afternoon on June 2nd, Lopez was driving that truck southbound, making his escape from the crime scene. It's important to note that Leon County authorities had searched the Collins ranch multiple times during that manhunt and found nothing. We don't know the exact sequence of events that happened on Collins' property that afternoon, but investigators have kept many details confidential. Based on what is known, though, we can piece together a likely scenario. Sometime that afternoon, Gonzalo Lopez encountered the Collins family at the ranch. It is possible that Lopez had been hiding either in a wooded area on or near their property. He may have even been inside of a barn or cabin before they arrived. Another possibility is that Lopez approached the home after hearing or seeing the family arrive, hoping to steal their vehicle and supplies. What is certain is that Lopez was armed with a knife or sharp object, and he wanted the Collins truck and firearms to get out of Leon County. Law enforcement immediately put two and two together. This was the worst case scenario that they had feared during the entire manhunt. Gonzalo Lopez had killed innocent people. The timing and location made it obvious that Lopez was the prime suspect. A violent escaped inmate was known to be in that area, and now a whole family was dead in the same area. Investigators noted the missing white Chevy pickup from the property and quickly broadcast out a regional bolo, or a be on the lookout if you don't know what that means, to the police that there was a stolen truck. The public was now in grave danger because Lopez was no longer on foot and desperate, and he was armed, had transportation, and clearly was willing to kill anybody that got in his way. Leon County Sheriff Kevin Ellis and DPS officials informed the media shortly after the grim discovery, warning that Lopez could be driving the Collins truck and that he had multiple firearms. An alert went out across Texas. Armed fugitive Gonzalo Lopez had murdered a family of 5 and is on the run in a stolen Chevy Silverado. Police in regions several hours away took up positions, not knowing where Lopez might head next. Unbeknownst to Lopez, his newfound mobility was also going to be his downfall. Now that he was in a vehicle, roadways and law enforcement networks could locate him and trap him far easier than him running around on foot. This dangerous chase was about to come to an end hundreds of miles from Centerville. With the murders discovered and the suspect identified, law enforcement raced to stop Gonzalo Lopez before he could harm anyone else. The alert for the stolen white Chevy truck went out statewide by the evening of June 2nd, the same day he stole the family's lives. Atascosa County, more than 200 miles southwest of Centerville, which is just south of San Antonio, would be where Lopez was spotted that night. Around 7 to 7:30 p.m., officers in Atascosa County, specifically in the town Jourdanton, Texas, reported seeing a vehicle matching the description of the Collins 1999 white Chevrolet Silverado. Jourdanton is approximately 35 miles or so outside of San Antonio, and it's largely a rural area. If you remember, this is close to where Lopez had known ties, family, and fellow gang members. The officers who spotted the truck realized that it had the same license plate as the Bolo and confirmed it was the stolen vehicle. Law enforcement trailed Lopez's truck discreetly for a time, calling for backup and planning to disable the vehicle safely so he, wouldn't get harmed. We'll see what happens with that shortly. It was now night or near nightfall on June 2nd. Rather than immediately engaging in a high-speed chase, the officers actually hung back to avoid alerting Lopez that he had been seen. This is a common tactic to prevent a desperate fugitive from doing something reckless with civilians around. Once additional units were in position, officers deployed spike strips on the road ahead of Lopez. Lopez, driving unsuspectingly, hit the spike strips, which punctured the tires of the truck. Even with shredded tires, Lopez did not immediately surrender. He kept driving, now more slowly, and as officers closed in, he then leaned out of the truck window with an AR-15 rifle and opened fire. Bullets flew in the darkness on that rural highway as Lopez was now shooting and pursuing law enforcement. He was armed with the AR-15 and a pistol, both of which were stolen from the Collins Ranch just hours earlier. Officers returned fire as they chased. The pursuit reached a dramatic end when Lopez's disabled truck crashed into a fence and telephone pole alongside the road near Jourdanton. The vehicle was no longer drivable. Now unable to run, Lopez had nowhere to go, but he still didn't give up. He exited the truck with the weapon and engaged in a final gunfight with law enforcement. A brief but intense exchange of gunfire ensued at the crash site. Multiple officers fired at Lopez and he was shot and killed at the scene. It was over in just a few moments. When the shooting stopped, Gonzalo Lopez laid lifeless on the ground and none of the officers had been injured. The time around this event was about 10:30 p.m. on June 2nd. On Lopez's body, officers found the rifle and pistol, officially confirming that he was armed with the Collins family's weapons during this shootout. Forensic checks later would verify that these guns officially belonged to Mark Collins. The nightmare was finally over. After 3 weeks on the run, Gonzalo Lopez was dead and he would never be able to hurt anyone again. But it was already too late. The end came just hours after the Collins family murders. Bittersweet timing. Had the welfare check or discovery been even an hour or two later, Lopez might have slipped away or even crossed into the Mexico border given more time. But swift communication and coordinated police work ensured that he was caught. As Texas Department of Criminal Justice spokesperson Jason Clark stated that night, quote, "Lopez was killed by law enforcement in Jourdanton. No officers were injured," end quote. The law enforcement community breathed a sigh of relief, that the manhunt was finally over, but they were also all aware that this victory was hollow. 5 innocent lives had been lost at the hands of Lopez before he could be stopped. I can only imagine the mix of emotions that the officers, community, and most importantly, the family felt: anger, relief, and sorrow. They had been chasing Lopez for weeks to prevent exactly this kind of tragedy from happening. Now, the primary goal was to bring justice for the Collins family and to examine how such an escape and rampage could have happened in the first place. Before we get to the legal portion, though, we have to learn about the family and Lopez's backgrounds. As we know, the 5 victims of this tragedy were Mark and his 4 grandsons, Waylon, Carson, Hudson, and Bryson. They were an active, tight-knit family from the Tomball area, which is a suburb of Houston, and they oftentimes spent weekends and summers at their ranch property near Centerville. In early June 2022, what was meant to be a fun-filled boys' trip to the family ranch turned into an unimaginable nightmare. It's really important to me that we get to know who the victims were in life because, like I've mentioned before, keeping their memory alive is keeping them alive. Mark was the patriarch of the Collins family. He was a man that was devoted to his faith, family, and his friends. A longtime resident of Northwest Houston area, Mark had been a pillar of his church community for over 4 decades. Friends and family described him as an excellent man who loved the outdoors and sharing ranch life with his kids and his grandkids. Mark was a father of 3. One of his sons, Chris Collins, would later say that he lost his father and all 3 of his sons in this tragedy. Mark often took the boys to Centerville Ranch for fishing, hunting, and bonding time, making memories that would last forever. And sadly, these would be some of their last memories. Waylon Collins was just 18 years old and the oldest of the grandchildren on the trip. Waylon had just graduated from Tomball High School in May of 2022. He was a charismatic, baseball-loving teenager, known as a leader among his peers and idolized by his younger brothers and cousin. Waylon played on his high school's baseball team and even served as a Little League umpire in his community. Tomball Little League held a moment of silence for him after his death, memorializing him with a framed umpire shirt and cap. Friends described Waylon as, quote, the type of guy that everybody was friends with, and he had a sweet soul, end quote. He had a bright future ahead, one that he never got to see because of the events on that fateful day. At 16, Carson was known for his tender heart and maturity beyond his years. Family members fondly called him a, quote, man among boys, end quote, despite his young age. Carson loved football and truly loved playing the game. He shared his older brother Waylon's passion for sports and the outdoors. Those who knew Carson remember him as a polite, responsible, and protective brother, especially over Hudson, but he also felt that way about Bryson. He had just finished his sophomore year of high school and was looking forward to summer adventures at the ranch. Hudson, one of the 2 11-year-olds, was the youngest of the 3 brothers. He was lovingly known as the snuggler of the family. Intelligent and empathetic, Hudson had a big heart and love for golf, which is an unusual hobby for such a young kid, but one that he excelled at and enjoyed playing with his grandpa. Hudson had just been baptized in the family pool just days before the trip, and this is a milestone that brought his family great joy and comfort. Hudson's gentle nature and bright smile made him a friend to everyone that he met. Bryson was also 11, the same age as Hudson, but Bryson was a cousin to the 3 other boys. All 4 were often known collectively just as Mark's grandsons. Bryson was, quote, everyone's best friend, end quote, with a vivacious personality and a nurturing spirit as an older brother himself. Family memories paint Bryson as a child full of faith and fun. For his 6th birthday, he famously asked for a Jesus-themed birthday party, and this is a request that kind of reflects the upbringing that he had in a very devout household. Bryson was a Tomball student just like his cousins, and he loved sports and adventure just as much as the other boys did. He was thrilled to join his grandfather and cousins on this early summer trip to Centerville. Together, these 5 family members formed a picture of pure joy in the days leading up to June 2nd of 2022. Just 1 week earlier, on May 26th, the school year had ended in Tomball, marking the start of summer vacation for the kids. The Collins boys had been looking forward to celebrating Waylon's high school graduation and the beginning of summer with a trip to their grandfather's ranch together. The plan was simple: spend quality time outdoors, fishing on the pond, riding around the property, practicing shooting, and just enjoying each other's company. Family friend David Crane later said it sounded like, quote, a Southern boy's dream excursion, end quote. Unknowingly to the Collins, however, a very dangerous man was in the vicinity, a fugitive whose presence would shatter their world within a matter of minutes. Now we're going to discuss the monster himself. Gonzalo Lopez, at just 46 years old, was no ordinary fugitive. He was a hardened criminal, serving 2 life sentences for brutal crimes in South Texas. Lopez's criminal history actually stretched back to the 1990s, escalating in violence over time. He had been described as a, quote, cartel hitman, end quote, who killed on behalf of the Mexican drug cartels and was affiliated with the Mexican Mafia prison gang. At the time of his escape in 2022, Lopez was locked up at the KHOU unit, which is a maximum security prison in Gatesville, under restrictive housing because of his violent history and high-risk profile. Lopez's known crimes paint a picture of a man that is capable of extreme brutality. As a young man in 1996, Lopez was convicted of 2 counts of aggravated assault, along with other charges, and served 8 years in prison. In 2004, Lopez was involved in a high-speed chase and shootout with law enforcement in South Texas. On May 11, 2004, he and an accomplice led sheriff's deputies on a car chase near the Texas-Mexico border. Lopez fired at officers with a handgun during the pursuit. A Webb County Sheriff's deputy was shot and injured in that incident, leading to an attempted capital murder charge. Lopez managed to evade capture for nearly a year after this. While still a fugitive from the 2004 incident, Lopez committed an even more heinous crime. On March 23, 2005, he and a fellow cartel member kidnapped someone by the name of Jose Ramirez. He did so from his home in Texas. Lopez was working at that time for the La Maña cartel based in Mexico. The cartel boss had ordered Ramirez kidnapped over an alleged $40,000 drug debt. Lopez and his partner tied up Ramirez, held his family at gunpoint, then took him to a remote location. Ramirez was held hostage and tortured for ransom. His family gave up their vehicles, money, and drugs hoping to save him, but ultimately, Lopez was ordered to execute him. He violently murdered him with a pickaxe, delivering 3 chop-type wounds to the man's head, and then they buried his body in the wooded area just next to his home. This gruesome killing would later earn Lopez a conviction for capital murder. Lopez was finally captured in April 2005 after a tip led authorities to him. He was tried for the Ramirez murder in early 2006, in February specifically, and he was found guilty of capital murder and aggravated kidnapping and then sentenced to life in prison. Additionally, after his role in the 2004 shootout was uncovered, Lopez was tried in 2007 for the attempted capital murder of the Webb County deputy. In December 2007, he was convicted and given a second life sentence to be served consecutively. Long story short, Gonzalo Lopez was never intended to breathe free air again. Lopez's reputation in prison was that he was a high-risk, violent offender. He was known to be affiliated with the Mexican Mafia, which, as we know, is a very powerful prison gang, and he had tattoos all across his body to confirm those affiliations. Because of his life terms and past behavior, Lopez was placed in restrictive housing, essentially isolation indefinitely, to limit his contact with other inmates and opportunities to cause trouble. Whenever he was transported outside the prison, he was supposed to be under extra tight security measures. In fact, on May 12, 2022, when he was scheduled for a transfer to another unit for a medical appointment, protocol dictated that Lopez ride in a separate caged compartment of the bus apart from lower risk inmates. He was also supposed to be thoroughly searched and restrained, but we know how that went. The system failed to do its job. The events of May 12th through June 2nd, 2022 left a permanent mark on the communities involved. In Leon County, Centerville, and Harris County, people were stunned and heartbroken. 5 lives across 3 generations in one family had been erased like that. The fact that it happened because of an escaped prisoner, something that never should have occurred, only deepened the outrage and grief in the community. In Tomball, the Collins family's hometown, the response was overwhelming. The Collins were well known and loved. They had deep roots in local churches, schools, and sports leagues. Vigils were held to honor the memory of Mark, Waylon, Carson, Hudson, and Bryson. On the evening of June 3rd, hundreds of people gathered at the Tomball High School baseball field for a candlelight vigil. Like we touched on earlier, Waylon had been a youth umpire on those very fields and had just worn his Tomball High School graduation cap. The community laid out a framed umpire jersey and Waylon's cap at home plate in tribute. Tomball Little League's official page posted, quote, Please join us as we mourn the loss of 4 Tomball students. The oldest of these children was an umpire at Tomball Little League." End quote. Grief counselors were made available for the students as the tragedy sent waves of sorrow through the school district. On Saturday, June 11, 2022, a funeral service for the Collins family was held at the Champion Forest Baptist Church in Northwest Harris County. A large crowd of thousands filled the church to pay respects. 5 caskets, each draped in flowers, and 4 draped with the boys' sports jerseys, stood at the front of the chapel. The service was emotional, filled with tears, but also laughter as friends and relatives shared moments and memories of the vibrant lives that had been cut short. Chris Collins, Mark's son and father of Waylon, Carson, and Hudson, spoke through tears to thank the community for their support. He recounted how their faith was sustaining them, even if they couldn't understand why this happened to them. I want to share with you a moment that Chris described as a moment of spiritual peace that he experienced. He said, quote, "The night before we had all the information, I looked up at my backyard and I said, 'God, tell me my babies are okay.' And I almost audibly could hear, 'They're okay, I've got them.'" End quote. His words, mixing unimaginable pain with grace, resonated with everyone present. The Collins family's pastor, Dr. Steve Besner, also spoke, praising the family's strong character and faith. Quote, "They have been pillars in this church and community for over 4 decades." End quote. Besner also said that the loss was just unbearable. Although they were all devastated, the family's message was one of hope, saying, quote, "While we're hurting more than we could ever imagine, we are going to be okay." End quote. Chris affirmed, holding on to the belief that they will reunite one day in heaven. Typically, we go into the trial portion in our assessment section, but there obviously won't be a trial in this case, so we need to discuss something equally important, and that's reform. The horrific outcome of Lopez's escape prompted immediate reactions from public officials. Texas Governor Greg Abbott issued a statement of condolences to the Collins family and vowed that the state would investigate how the escape happened and, quote, "ensure that something like this never happens again," end quote. Local leaders like State Senator John Whitmire, who chairs the Texas Senate Criminal Justice Committee, spoke out and he stated, quote, "This tragedy was totally preventable," end quote. I agree. He pointed out the obvious security lapses and pressed TDCJ for answers. By June 5th, Senator Whitmire was calling for specific changes. Quote, "We never should have allowed a capital murderer serving a life sentence to travel across the state in a bus without additional security. If they are on a bus, there should be a trailing security vehicle armed to ensure that the inmate does not escape," end quote. He criticized the policy of only having 2 officers on the transport, driver and 1 guard, and he said he would push for 3 officers on board, plus an escort vehicle for transports of violent inmates. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice itself came under intense public scrutiny. The agency's director, Brian Collier, released a statement acknowledging the system failures. He stated, quote, "Public safety is the core mission of TDCJ, and as an agency, we failed to meet that mission," end quote. He promised to, quote, "hold ourselves accountable, identify the failures that led to this escape, and take steps to ensure it never happens again," end quote. This admission of failure was actually significant. TDCJ essentially took responsibility for setting the stage for this tragedy. The general public and media were demanding to know, how did Lopez manage to get free? Who messed up, and what are we going to do about it? In the days immediately following the incident, TDCJ temporarily suspended all inmate transport statewide. They did this on June 6th at Senator Whitmire's urging, effectively saying no non-essential transports would occur until a full review of procedures had been done. If an emergency transport was needed, like for medical reasons, let's say, then they vowed to implement additional security. This was a direct and immediate policy action, indicating how seriously the agency was actually taking this criticism. The murders also reignited debates at the Texas state capitol about prison staffing and resources. It was widely known that TDCJ had severe staffing shortages. The KHOU's unit, where Lopez, for instance, was housed, was nearly 40% understaffed around that time. Some lawmakers pointed out that they needed to raise the pay to attract more qualified correctional officers. They also needed better training and more rigorous oversight. There was also talk of perhaps using more modern transportation methods for the most dangerous inmates. For instance, transports would happen with individual cages or vans instead of group buses, or even telemedicine to avoid the inmates from being moved for appointments at all. The media coverage was relentless, not only telling the story of the family and escape, but also holding TDCJ's feet to the fire. The Texas Tribune published investigative pieces with titles like Texas Deadly Prison Bus Escape Caused by Understaffing. Then the Associated Press ran articles titled Multitude of Security Lapses That Led to This Escape. The fact that internal and external reviews were already underway, as mentioned by Collier, meant that by late 2022, official findings would be released, as they should be. The aftermath for the community was a mix of profound sorrow and determination. The Collins family's deaths became a rallying cry for change. Their names, Mark, Waylon, Carson, Hudson, and Bryson, were invoked in the halls of Texas legislature in the TDCJ meeting rooms as a somber reminder of what can happen when the system fails. In the wake of the Lopez escape and the Collins family murders, a thorough examination of systemic failures was conducted. Both TDCJ's internal team and an independent firm were tasked with reviewing every aspect of the escape incident. Their findings were released in December of 2022, and they revealed a disturbing pattern of protocol violations, security lapses, and complacency that made the escape possible. The TDCJ agency did something unprecedented. It brought in an outside firm known as CGL to do an independent investigation, acknowledging that an external eye would actually lend credibility and perhaps catch things that TDCJ insiders might miss. The CGL report mirrored TDCJ's findings and also highlighted that staff complacency and supervisory lapses were also to blame. This essentially validated what many suspected. This wasn't a freak accident or some Ocean 11 style inmate mastermind. It was a result of systemic security failings. One particularly striking anecdote from the report was that on the bus, Lopez had been so bold as to try recruiting other inmates to join his escape. He asked if they were ready to rock and roll, and one inmate initially agreed, if you recall. That inmate later changed his mind because Lopez's plan was too heinous to murder people. The fact that Lopez had enough time to conspire with other people en route underscores how unchecked he was. According to the two reviews, both TDCJ and CGL, the May 12th escape was not caused by one single error, but a cascade of multiple failures. The reports state plainly, when serious incidents of this type occur, it's not a single failure, but the compilation of multiple failures. That was the case with the Lopez escape. Here are the key failures that they identified. Even though we've already touched on it, Lopez was not properly strip searched at several points on May 12th. Officers either skipped steps or looked away, allowing Lopez to conceal contraband. One officer even falsified a cell search log, claiming to have searched Lopez's cell prior to transport when he, in fact, had not. Proper searches would likely have caught the handcuff key that Lopez had and the two metal shanks that he was also carrying. This was deemed perhaps the most glaring failure of them all. Basic security procedure was not followed. Lopez's restraints, or the handcuffs and the leg irons, were not secured as tightly or as effectively as they should have been. The quote-unquote cuff protector device was meant to block the keyholes on his handcuffs, and guess what? That was also inappropriately applied, and it didn't cover the keyhole, making it virtually useless. His leg shackles were put on over his pants like we've talked about, leaving slack. These errors gave Lopez physical mobility enough to execute his plan. Skipping the Bosch chair scan was a critical lapse in judgment. That chair could have detected the metal in Lopez's body or in his mouth. Reports emphasize this step takes just less than a minute and was required for someone like Lopez, yet it was inexplicably not done. Once on the bus, Lopez and the other inmates in the rear compartment were left unsupervised for an extended period of time prior to departure, which also violates their own policy. Then, during transit, Officer Breiniger failed to notice the commotion because the inmates were successfully distracting him. The reviews suggest that the officers were also possibly complacent, assuming that the cage and restraints were secure and letting their guard down. The KHOU's unit was severely understaffed, with only 60% of its positions being filled on that day. The officers on duty were likely overworked and maybe even also just less experienced, but the CGL independent report noted an, quote, environment where correctional officers had clearly become complacent, end quote, due to chronic staffing issues and confusion in policies. The vacancy rates at KHOU's unit was 43% the month prior, indicating a systemic issue of not enough eyes and oversight on high-risk inmates. Similar to nursing days where staff runs short, I just want to add that this just reinforces the entity's responsibility for safe staffing. Stating that they were understaffed is not an excuse for poor policy adherence. This still falls on them. Some TDCJ transport policies were described as confusing or inconsistently followed. For example, there was supposed to be a pre-transport briefing or checklist that might have been skipped that day. Also, it wasn't clearly enforced that no one opens a restrictive housing inmate cell without a supervisor present and a strip search. Those rules were bent by multiple officers that morning and in history. The officers involved faced consequences. Disciplinary action was taken against more than 20 TDCJ staff and supervisors for failing to comply with policies, and I personally agree with that. Some of them were fired, others were demoted or suspended. The investigations also revealed instances of falsified logs, like we mentioned, and other corners cut in daily routines. There was even the suggestion that some failures might warrant criminal charges for falsifying records, though, as of current, the Leon County District Attorney has not announced any prosecutions of the officers. Following these revelations, TDCJ and Texas officials moved to implement changes to ensure that a tragedy like this would never happen again. Here are the key proposed or enacted policy changes in the aftermath. Senator Whitmire's proposal was essentially adopted as a guideline. Any transport of extremely violent or high-risk inmates now requires additional armed security on board. TDCJ announced that for such inmates, they would use 3 officers on board instead of 2 and consider using a trailing chase vehicle. Previously, no escort car followed inmate buses. Now they plan to deploy one, especially when moving killers like Lopez. The TDCJ reviewed all its restraint devices. After Lopez escaped a loose leg restraint and a misapplied cuff protector, the agency mandated refresher training on proper application of restraints. They also looked into new technologies like more tamper-proof cuffs and perhaps body scanners at unit exits, not just a stationary boss chair. One idea floated around was using electronic stun belts on violent inmates during transport, which could be monitored and activated remotely if an inmate attempted to flee. The policies around strip searches, transport prep, and documentation were re-clarified and re-emphasized. Wardens were instructed that no exceptions or shortcuts are acceptable for restrictive housing inmates. This culture of informal compliance had to be eradicated. For example, if policy states that 2 officers must strip search an inmate thoroughly, then supervisors must enforce that every single time. This is a long-term challenge, but the Texas legislature at TDCJ recognized that understaffing contributed to this disaster. In 2023, the Texas Department of Criminal Justice sought funding to increase correctional officers' salaries, hoping to fill some of those vacancies and reduce forced overtime that can also lead to lapses in judgment. The Texas Sunset Advisory Commission, which reviews state agencies, also examined TDCJ in the aftermath and made recommendations for improving staff levels and trainings. TDCJ did an audit of its own transportation procedures statewide. All officers assigned to transport duties were retrained on emergency procedures. For instance, what to do if an inmate tries to grab a weapon, how to respond if the transport compartment is breached, and more. The training would highlight the Lopez incident as a case study. By late 2022 and early 2023, Texas lawmakers were drafting legislation to codify some of these changes. Senator Whitmire, in particular, was vocal about introducing a bill in the next session to require certain standards for inmate transport, potentially including funding for secure transport vehicles, like individual cages, or better armored sections for dangerous inmates. In addition to policy and legislative changes, victim advocacy groups and the Collins Families Church community put their efforts into remembering the victims. In one positive development, the Collins family set up a foundation to honor the boys and Mark, focusing on faith and youth sports, reflecting their lives. There were charity baseball tournaments organized in Waylon's memory, scholarships in the names of all of the boys at Tomball High School, and even discussions about improving emergency communication in those rural areas so that neighbors might be alerted if a manhunt is going on nearby. Ultimately, TDCJ leadership took responsibility publicly, and some individual employees were held accountable. The question of legal liability lingered, though. Could the Collins family sue the state for negligence? In Texas, it's kind of a challenging gray area to sue state agencies for such incidents like this due to sovereign immunity, but egregious negligence could potentially form the basis of a claim. As of now, no lawsuit has been publicly reported, but it wouldn't be surprising if legal actions were filed on behalf of the Collins estate. At minimum, the incident has become a significant event prompting introspection within Texas's criminal justice system. The Leon County Sheriff's Office and local officials, too, reviewed their roles. Did they do everything possible during the manhunt? The consensus was that local law enforcement did their best with the information and resources that they had available at that time. But according to them, the breakdown occurred at the point of the escape. I would argue that it took place before that, though. Leon County's small force had hundreds of outside officers assisting, and for a while, they did contain Lopez until they didn't. Some locals quietly questioned if the search should have even been called off or maybe just reduced on May 20th, implying that maybe they should have kept the area flooded with officers longer. But hindsight's 2020, and Lopez was deceptive at hiding, and he had experience with this in the past. What's clear is that systemic changes often come at a cost, and in this case, the cost was 5 precious lives. The reforms and firings cannot provide comfort to the Collins family, but they offer hope that Mark, Waylon, Carson, Hudson, and Bryson did not die in vain. Their story has already led to improved practices that could save lives in the future. The story of Gonzalo Lopez's escape and the Centerville murders is an example of how a series of small failures can snowball into catastrophe. It is the story of a community's worst nightmare, a dangerous criminal on the loose, and the heartbreaking outcome that no one could imagine. But it's also a story of love and legacy. The love within the Collins family and the legacy that they left behind. The Collins family, through their grief, have demonstrated tremendous strength and resilience. In a written statement released to the media, the extended Collins family said, quote, "These precious people who loved and were loved by so many will never be forgotten," end quote. They expressed deep gratitude for the outpouring of support and asked for continued prayers. Relatives like Glenn Collins, Mark's brother, told reporters, "There's a purpose in this. We're leaning on our faith to get us through." They emphasized that while they demanded answers and, of course, accountability, they also forgave Lopez for what he did, a stance that is deeply rooted in their Christian beliefs, though profoundly difficult to embrace, and I don't know if I could do it. The family also publicly thanked law enforcement for their efforts in hunting Lopez and for ending the threat when they could. They acknowledged that the blame lies not with the officers who ultimately killed Lopez, but with the failures that allowed him to escape in the first place. This distinction became important in the community narrative. People were not angry at the frontline officers. They were angry at the system, TDCJ specifically, that had let them down. In the end, 5 innocent lives were lost. Mark Collins and his grandsons, Waylon, Carson, Hudson, and Bryson, will be forever remembered as more than the victims that they were. They were vibrant individuals who lived their lives with faith, kindness, and joy. In a very emotional moment, Tom Ball retired the baseball jersey number that Waylon wore. The boys' church camp planted 5 trees in their memory. Mark's men's group established a scholarship in his honor. These gestures ensure that long after the headlines have faded, the Collins family's impact on their community will endure forever. As for Gonzalo Lopez, his name now stands as an example of the extreme consequences that happen when lapses in judgment occur. Texas officials have made it clear that lessons have been learned. The Texas Department of Criminal Justice implemented new measures, and the state's leadership has taken steps to prevent this type of tragedy from happening again. Already, reports indicate that transports of violent inmates are handled with far greater care and manpower than before. Correctional staff have been reminded vigorously that complacency can kill, literally. Every strip search, every locked door, every log entry can be the difference between safety and disaster. In a joint legislative hearing later in 2022, lawmakers grilled prison officials, and the refrain was, "This must never happen again." Residents still recall the fear of those 3 weeks and the sorrow that followed. At a 1-year anniversary in May 2023, locals held a small vigil at the Leon County Courthouse lawn, lighting candles in memory of the Collins family. Some still ask why Mark chose to come to the ranch that week given the recent escape, but blame lies squarely on the man who murdered them and the broken system that enabled him, not on a grandfather trying to spend quality time with his grandkids. This case serves as a reminder the unthinkable can happen when cracks in the system go unaddressed. In closing, we honor the memory of the Collins family. I hope that by learning and retelling this story, we can add to the calls for accountability and improvement that arose from this case. The last words at the Collins funeral were a message of faith. Quote, "None of us can understand why," Pastor Besner said, "but we continue to trust that God is good and He is with us even under these circumstances." End quote. As heartbreaking as this story is, it is important that it be told factually so that Mark, Waylon, Carson, Hudson, and Bryson are never forgotten, and so that the failures that led to their loss are never repeated or overshadow them. I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for spending this time with me today, guys. Don't forget to drop any case recommendations that you have down below in the comments, and comment a butterfly if you made it to the very end. Also, I want to plan on doing a fun giveaway when we hit 1,000 subscribers, so please go take a look at that poll that I posted to formally cast your vote on what you would love to possibly win. I hope that you guys enjoyed getting 2 videos this week. I just kind of wanted to test and see, what days you guys were more available to watch, whether it be Monday or Saturday, but I think we're locked into Saturdays now. So moving forward, you can count on seeing my face every weekend. Please be sure to take the best care of yourselves possible. Nurse's orders. Bye.